Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming this afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Krista Johnson. I'm a director of the Center for African Studies at Howard University, and most of us are students here, which is great, so I think most of you, but thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. Today, actually, we have a pretty full week of interesting events going on this week in particular. But today, we're really very happy to have with us Dr. Ricardo Larémont. I will read his bio, but the most significant item on his bio is that he is actually currently a non-resident fellow with us at the center, and we're really very happy to have him at the center. Dr. Larémont has kind of tangentially been kind of circling Howard and has been kind of part of the scholarly network with many of our colleagues here at Howard for a number of years. So it's always nice to have him on campus and to welcome him back to campus, of course. And we're really happy that we have an opportunity at the center to perhaps strengthen that relationship and to perhaps really kind of solidify some collaborations that we can continue to work on in the future. So, we're here this afternoon to hear Dr. Larémont talk about his most recent book, which is Political Islam: Movements, Ideologies, and Governance in Comparative Perspective. Dr. Larémont is a political scientist, sociologist, and international consultant whose work focuses on political Islam, Islamic law, comparative governance, conflict resolution, and civil-military relations. Over nearly 3 decades of research, teaching, and advisory engagement across North Africa, West Africa, the Sahel, and the wider Muslim world, his career has been shaped by a sustained effort to understand how religion, law, and political authority interact in historically and institutionally specific contexts. Professor Larémont is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Sociology at SUNY Binghamton, where he pursued a career that combined scholarship, undergraduate and graduate teaching, and academic leadership. He received his Ph.D. in political science from Yale University and his J.D. from the NYU School of Law, a combination that has informed his longstanding interest in legal systems, constitutional authority, and the political uses of law in both democratic and non-democratic settings. Dr. Larémont's scholarly work examines Islamist movements, Islamic legal traditions, and state-society relations in Africa and the Middle East through a comparative and historically grounded lens. This most recent book offers a systematic comparative analysis of Islamist ideas, organizational forms, and government practices across the Muslim world. So without further ado, he has a long bio, needless to say. This is one of several monographs that he has published and has been a prolific writer on a number of other subjects as well. So, but without further ado, I want to invite Professor Larémont to come and give some kind of a context for the book and kind of a framing of the theoretical framework for the book. And then I'm going to invite our PhD student, soon-to-be Dr. Amat Jeng to join us and to lead a discussion and conversation with Dr. Larémont. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Dr. Johnson for that extraordinary introduction. And I really want to say I'm really honored to be here at Howard, which is such a significant institution in terms of how knowledge is produced in America. Its significance is extraordinary, and being in this place is a place of honor for me. Besides thanking Dr. Johnson, who is the director of the Center of African Studies at Howard, I need to take time out to thank two stalwart colleagues who have always been with me side by side as I've been advancing in my work. And one is Jerónimo Augusto, and the other one is Reynaldo Ortiz Minaya, whose support, both intellectual and personal, has made my work possible. I also want to thank in advance soon-to-be Dr. Ahmad Jang, who will be providing comments about what I'm about to say. This book, for those of you in TV land or video land, is Political Islam, Movements, Ideologies, and Governance in Comparative Perspective. It's a reflection of more than 30 years of thinking about this subject and not really being satisfied with the textbooks that were out there. The book, as I have envisioned it, has 2 chapters that are theoretical, and I'll be talking about those 2 theoretical chapters in today's talk. And then after moving from these 2 theoretical chapters, there is discussion of specific either Muslim states or Muslim movements, among which are the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the ideological legacy of Sayyid Qutb, Iran and its Shia theocracy, and also resistance movements like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Taliban. In this work, I've moved beyond Africa. The first monograph that I wrote almost 25 years ago was Islam and the Politics of Resistance in Algeria, which examined Islam, how Islam motivated resistance movements. And then I moved on to my second monograph, which was Islamic Law and Politics in Northern Nigeria, which moves from Islam as movement-based to examining Islam in governance. So there's movements, there's governance, and there's ideology. And I discuss all of these in this textbook. What I want to do today, in today's talk, is really go into the theoretical realm. And theory can be burdensome, but I'm going to try to make this theoretical discussion as clear and as lucid as I can possibly do. Now, where do we start? We start in chapters 1 and chapters 2. And what I do in chapter 1 is I step back historically and I try to explain to the reader how Judaism, Christianity, and Islam each configured the relationship between divine authority and political power. How were these relationships in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam similar? And how were they different? What I try to do in chapter 2 is to look at democracy as it is defined in Western democratic models. And then I try to explain how they interact with Islamic legal and political frameworks. In other words, how is democracy going to be understood in the West? How is it constructed in Islamic societies? Now, the central claim that I have in this book is straightforward, but at the same time, I think it is important. And this is my central thesis. The political role of religion is not simply the mechanical outcome of theology. It is not the mechanical outcome of theology. It is the product, and this is important, of specific historical contingencies, legal traditions, and philosophical struggles. That's a mouthful, but it's an important mouthful. Historical contingencies. What happens in history that changes the occurrence and transmission of events? Legal traditions. How is law to be understood in the West and also in Islam? And third, and importantly, philosophical struggles, particularly within Islam, but also within Christianity, about the relationship between reason and faith. Especially an important medieval discussion in Islam and within Judaism that contributed to how Christianity would think about the relationship between faith and power. So, again, historical contingencies, legal traditions, and philosophical struggles. Then I asked, how have different societies, including Muslim majority ones, actually negotiated legitimacy, authority, and justice over time? In my case studies, the outcomes are all different. Saudi Arabia is not Iran. Saudi Arabia and Iran are not like the multi-ethnic and multinational countries of Nigeria, Malaysia, and Indonesia. They're not like secularly oriented countries like Tunisia and Turkey. So what we see in Islam is a diversity of thought in terms of how these particular issues of legitimacy, authority, and justice were to be negotiated over time. So let's start at the beginning with Judaism. This is the beginning of the monotheistic prototype. Judaism gives us a very sophisticated model of sacred kingship under law. I'll say it again, sacred kinship under law. In ancient Israel, political authority emerged out of the shift from a tribal configuration to a centralized monarchy. Eventually became a centralized monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon. These kings were not simply strongmen, they were messiahs. They were divinely anointed rulers whose legitimacy rested on Yahweh's covenant with his people. So the covenant of Yahweh is important. But what's important is that these kings, these Messiah, were bounded. Their power was not unlimited because it had the Torah as the basis of a constitutional order. Specifically, the book of the covenant, the Holy Code, and the Deuteronomic law that function as what we can say is a constitutional framework within Judaism. So it's bounded by law. Its religious law was bounded by law. But there's a second basis of the control of the monarch, which is prophetic oversight. Prophets such as Samuel and Nathan function as moral auditors of royal behavior. Samuel can anoint Saul, but also rebukes him, and eventually declares that God has rejected him. Nathan confronts Bathsheba Nathan confronts David over his affair with Bathsheba. So the king, even though he is anointed, is subject to a higher law. Third basis of constraining the state is priestly authority. There was a class of priests called the Levites, and these Levites figure prominently in control of access to the temple. They interpret the law and they cultivate orthodoxy. They function as another check on the power of the Jewish monarch. So from the very beginning in this monotheistic story, we have a model of political power that is sacralized, but it is not unconstrained. Kingship is divine in origin, but prophetic and priestly institutions limited in the name of law and justice. Let's move to Christian Europe. Divine right and its critique. In medieval and early modern Christian Europe, the basic idea for divine sanction of rulers was radicalized into a notion that we know as the divine right of kings. Here again, rulers are seen as governing by God's will, but now in a way that makes them accountable only to God. Unlike the Jewish model, there's no constraint from prophets, right? They're not constrained by their subjects. And this became manifest in the Holy Roman Empire, although there were conflicts between the monarch and the Pope. But then we reach its apogee in France and England, where theorists like Jean Baudin James I, and Robert Filmer argued that sovereignty in the European Christian context had to be unitary, indivisible, and unchallenged. So when we look about this relationship between religion and the state in this medieval Christianity, a sort of unbridled, unconstrained power residing in the monarch. But that will be checked, as we know, in the 17th and 18th century with 18th century Enlightenment thought, particularly John Locke, particularly of natural law and natural rights that resided in the individual that were inalienable and could not be taken away by the king. That then became the basis of civil rights in the European, in the English context, and also in the United States. Going forward further, we see in Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the Social Contract the notion that the power of the king should be limited because we needed magistrates to keep the power of the monarch in check. So what we see in the Christian West is an arc from divinely ordained near absolute monarchy to 18th century notions of constitutionalism, particular popular sovereignty, and secular legitimacy. And this arc we will re-examine and think about how it is associated with the West. Now let's move to Islam. Islam follows a different trajectory because it begins with a different theological premise. And that is the principle of Tawheed, unity, absolute unity and sovereignty of God. So the notion of sovereignty is that sovereignty resides in God. Because sovereignty, and this is important in thinking of Sayyid Qutb, is indivisible, this is important juridically and theologically, there is no independent, autonomous, secular domain. Law and politics are supposed to be ordered under Sharia, and Sharia itself is derived from the Quran, from the Sunnah as expressed in the Ahadith, which is the example of Prophet Muhammad and his followers, and also the elaboration of juridical principles by Muslim scholars and judges. My argument here, an argument made by others, however, is that this notion of governance, even though it is one in which sovereignty is indivisible, nevertheless has democratic aspects. And for those of us in the West who are trying to understand the politics of Islam, we have to become familiar with the vocabulary and the concepts that provide the basis for the elaboration of democratic principles within Islam. And what are they? Shura, which is consultation. Justice, which is adl. Equity, which is qist. These three elements, along with the Quran, the Sunnah, and the interpretations of these of the justices, but these three concepts, shura, justice, and equity, give us the language and the vocabulary to articulate a comprehensive framework for understanding how humans should behave personally and how they engage the state and government. Within this framework, and this is where I say that philosophical discussions are important, there was a very important discussion that occurred in the Middle Ages among Muslim and Jewish theologians about the proper relationship between reason and revelation. Who were these actors? There were four. Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, Maimonides was known as Maimon ibn Rushd as well, and Thomas Aquinas. And let me tell you why these four people are important in addition to Al-Ghazali, which I'll discuss later. The basis for thinking about secularism in Western thought, the possibility that there is a secular space, emerges from the thinking of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica. In that grand statement, reduced to a simplicity, he says that reason is a gift from God. There is no contradiction between reason and revelation, and the exercise in reason is a godly exercise. That is Aquinas' summation. But Aquinas did not get this idea from nowhere. It came from Ibn Sina, it came from Ibn Rushd, and it came from Maimonides, the three of whom examine the same question. The key thing that I'm trying to explain in this chapter is that the struggle between reason and revolution was not the inevitable outcome of Scripture, but rather they were the outcomes of important intellectual and institutional struggles. Now, I'm going to go back to the question of Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and Maimonides in a minute, but let me just take a point of departure to re-emphasize how it is that we think about Islam and democracy in the West. There, if you're in political science, there are like two basic schools of defining democracy. There's the minimalist school. You only have to have elections. And the proponents of this minimalist schools are famous political scientists like Schumpeter, Popper, and Prigozhin. So all you have to do is have elections. But you don't have to have anything more than that. And there's a maximalist school, people like Robert Dahl, Larry Diamond, Fareed Zakari, etc. So you have to have more than that. You have to have rule of law. You have to have an independent judiciary. You have to have checks and balances. You have to have protection of civil and political rights. You have to have freedom of expression, association, religion, and the press. So they go beyond just simply having elections, saying you need to have these other things. And among them is the constraint of rule of law and the institutional separation of powers. Taken together, these create what's known as a secular paradigm. The state does not derive its authority from revelation, like Judaism from the Bible, or Islam from the Quran and the Sunnah. So the American and British, they don't take that. It's not from revelation. It's from a system based upon law and procedures around law. That is in contrast to the Islamic tradition. Because in the Islamic tradition, the Quran and the Sunnah provide a comprehensive network basis for personal and for participation in governance. Now let me return to the principles, as I articulated in this first chapter, provide the basis for Islamic governance. The first I mentioned earlier, that is shura. What does shura mean? It means consultation. This is rooted in the Quran, that you cannot make decisions with regard to the state unless there is consultation among the believers. Modern theorists of Islam say that because of shura, there is a basis for the creation of representative institutions and participatory politics. Not the same as the West, not identical, but analogous. There are institutions because of shura that can be created within Islam. The second basis of Islamic democracy is ijma', which is consensus. Now, traditionally, ijma' was defined as the consensus of qualified jurists on points of law. but thinkers like Muhammad Fadl have pushed this further, suggesting that ijma should be interpreted to include broader, institutionalized forms of collective decision-making, such as legislative bargaining, electoral representation, and so forth. So we see that there's thinkers within the Muslim world itself who are taking the principle of Islam and building upon that to fashion arguments for a distinctive form of Islamic democracy. The third is the principle of maslahah, or public interest, in which public welfare is considered important within Islamic governance. And Khalid Abu al-Fadl emphasizes that maslahah must be rooted in ethical deliberation and transparency, and not as a cynical tool of convenience. So he says that the principle of maslahah values accountability and inclusion. And lastly, Abdullahi al-Nahim argues of secularism from within. It's a little bit more controversial topic. And he says that for Islamic norms to retain general moral authority, they must be embraced fully and not imposed by the state. Naim also advocates secular constitutional frameworks that protect religious freedom, allowing Muslims to live in their commitments voluntarily rather than the coercive enforcement of Sharia. Abdullahi al-Naim is sort of on the liberal left extreme of this corpus of Muslim thinkers that I've mentioned, but nonetheless, I think he has a great deal to say about the construction of Islamic democracy. So when we take these principles, I think we can arrive at the conclusion that the Islamic tradition has its own indigenous principles that can be mobilized in the support of ethical governance, deliberation, and public accountability, even if these forms differ from Western liberal democracy. Everybody following? Right? Mm-hmm. That's what I'm trying to say. You can take the principles of ijma, shura, maslahah, adl, qist. You can take the writings of Abdullahi al-Naim, Khalid Abu al-Fadl, and others, and have the basis for the construction of a form of democracy that is analogous to the West, but different from the West. It resonates as possibly being more durable because it is enracinated in indigenous traditions. The language, the symbols, the expressions of democracy, when used from the language of the Quran, can resonate in Muslim majority societies in ways that Western language, Western concepts may not carry as much leverage. Now, having laid out what I think are the bases for both Western form of democracy and Islamic form of democracy, let me briefly talk about 5 governance models that are articulated in Chapter 1 in an attempt to understand the variety of the expressions of Islam within Muslim majority states. They are Sharia dominant regimes. Secondly, hybrid Sharia civil law systems. Third, dual legal systems. Fourth, secular states with Muslim majorities. And fifth, post-religious secular states with no Sharia influence. And I'm just going to briefly illustrate with a few cases. When we look at the Muslim world, there are only 2 regimes in which Sharia is dominant. They are Saudi Arabia and Iran. And increasingly, Saudi Arabia is not the case because Mohammed bin Salman is moving the Saudi state in another direction in the last few years. So we may not even be able in the long term to keep Saudi Arabia under this category, but before Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia, the Quran and the Sunnah were explicitly treated as the constitution. Now, this system is conservative, formed by Hanbali thinking, the legacy of Wahhabism and Wahhabi reforms. There is a consultative council in Saudi Arabia, but it's largely advisory because real power resides in the monarchy. And its legitimacy is drawn from its alliance with religious scholars. But as we said, under Mohammed bin Salman, the political center has weakened the clerics and has moved power to the royal court. In Iran, we have a Shia theocracy created about this notion of vilayat al-faqih within Shia thought was considered a minor way of thinking about politics. That somehow power is entirely enshrined in the supreme leader. At least 4 or 5 prominent Ayatollahs disagreed with the Ayatollah Khomeini about this concept, but in the context of the Iranian Revolution, it was his interpretation of how the state should be articulated that was eventually victorious. But most Shia scholars disagree with how he articulated how the state should be constructed. So in this state, the supreme leader has power, along with the Council of Guardians, and in a regime in which control is at the center. There were revolts in 2022 that were put down. There's a more recent revolt in Iran just 2 weeks ago, and claimed 30 to 35,000 people have been killed. So it's clear that within this state, the center has held. The monarchy is in control, and it will continue to be in control of this theocratic state. So those are the 2 states in which Sharia are important. But look, the rest of the world, Muslim world, is rather different. We have hybrid systems. Who are the hybrid systems? They are Pakistan and Egypt. In Pakistan, we have British common law that exists along with a federal Sharia. British common law along with a federal Sharia system. Some domains, family law, who do defenses, interest rate related disputes, are explicitly under the Sharia courts. But other, especially commercial transactions, are often ruled by British law. In Egypt, you see a similar hybrid. Sharia is the principal source of legislation according to the new constitution. But it is the Supreme Constitutional Court, which is a state-controlled court, that determines the application of the Sharia, not Al-Azhar, right? So the interpretation of the law is still under the control of the state. Even in Egypt today, we have French law that can apply in certain cases. So notice this hybridity in Pakistan and in Egypt. Then let's go on to the next fascinating set of cases, which are dual legal systems. We have Nigeria, we have Malaysia, we have Indonesia, all of which, Nigeria could be Muslim majority, maybe not, who knows? Malaysia, clearly Muslim majority, but with significant Chinese and Tamil population. Indonesia, a particular way of thinking of the state under Pancasila, which embraces a variety of religions. So again, it's different. It's not every state is Sharia. No, every state is different because they have a different society. They're dealing with different sets of social issues. They're dealing with diverse societies. Nigeria has a Muslim north. It has a somewhat Muslim and indigenous religion and Protestant, maybe Protestant southwest. It has Igbos, many of them are Catholic. There's a hybridity in Nigeria that forces the state to create a kind of flexible matrix of governance. So we see that in Nigeria, but we see it in Malaysia as well. Sharia is reserved for family issues, but criminal and commercial matters are completely under the control of secular courts. Pancasila embraces Buddhism as a recognized religion it recognizes Christianity as an acceptable religion under the Constitution. So again, when we look at Malaysia, when we look at Indonesia, we see this kind of diversity in terms of thinking about the law. Let's go even further. We have, well, what used to be two fundamentally secular states. One is Tunisia, and the other one is Turkey. Now, Turkey in the last 15 years has been moving more and more in a conservative direction, but the Constitution itself states directly that it is a secular state. Same thing with the Tunisian situation, both of which, because of their founders, were established on a secular basis. The Turkish code was based upon the Swiss civil code, and the AKP under Erdogan has been moving in a more Islamist direction, but nonetheless the architecture of the state is still secular, although moving in a somewhat Islamist direction. In Tunisia, nothing has changed. It's still a secular state. There may be Islamist movements, but the courts are still under the control of the secular state. And then finally, we have this crazy outlier, which Albania, which was a remnant of the Ottoman Empire upon the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. Before it was dissolved, it was mostly Christian. As a result of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, it became marginally more Muslim. But then the founder of the state, Enver Hoxha, created a communist state that denied the possibility of religion, because it was also tied to the former Yugoslavia, so that religion exited from the political vocabulary, political operations of the state. Since the fall of the communist regime, the current constitution affirms the neutrality of the state in matters of religion, but again, there is no official religion. So let me finish chapter 1. Taken together, this approach arrives at the simple conclusion. There is no simple model, there's no single Islamic model of governance. There are multiple, historically contingent, legal and constitutional arrangements, all negotiating in different ways the relationship between Islamic norms, state power, and democratic aspirations. I hope that the chapter itself makes that clear for Western audiences who think that all Islam is Sharia. That's just not the case. Let me very quickly go through chapter 1 and the takeaways that I have for chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 1, this is conclusion, shows us that all three monotheisms grapple with how to link divine sovereignty and political authority. Point 2, each tradition experiments in different institutional balances. Kings, prophets, and priests, popes and emperors, caliphs, jurists, and theologians. Over time, this is point 3, we see different trajectories. In the Christian West, a faith-reason synthesis that eventually facilitates secularism, liberalism, and constitutionalism. In much of the Muslim world, the consolidation of legal and theological traditions in which revelation and Sharia remain central to public legitimacy. Chapter 2 then asks, what happens when modern state building, colonial legacies, and globalization intersect with these traditions? And the answers are diverse. In some cases, we see theocratic or Sharia dominant regimes. In others, we see hybrid dual systems that try to manage pluralism or reconcile competing legal heritages. In still others, we see secular models, some homegrown, some imposed, some deeply contested. These cases make it very hard to sustain civilizational cliches such as Islam is inherently undemocratic or the West is inherently secular. Instead, what we see are historical trajectories, institutional choices, intellectual debates that produce different outcomes. I'm going to say that again because it's important. We see different historical trajectories, institutional choices, and intellectual debates that produce different outcomes. So the question I invite you to keep in mind as we move into the later chapters on the Muslim Brotherhood, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Taliban is not, is Islam compatible with democracy? But rather, which interpretations of Islam embedded in which institutions and which historical contexts enable or obstruct democratic practices, constitutionalism, and pluralism. So I'll stop here. In the remainder of the book, I move from these theoretical and comparative foundations to specific Islamist movements and regimes, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Taliban, asking how each of them appropriates, reinterprets, or distorts the legacies I've outlined today. But for now, I'd be very interested, first of all, in your critiques rather than your questions. I'm more interested in critiques because I know I didn't get this right. And what you think about the typology, and what do you think about the idea that these outcomes are contingent? They're not theologically predetermined. And whether you see any hope or tensions in linking the Islamic principles I described with democratic governance. So I really want to thank Howard because it's an incredible home and a great legacy, and I'm really glad to be a small part of it. Thank you.
I invite you to take a seat, and I think you're gonna go there? Sure. Oh, then you might be sitting by yourself.
What do you prefer? Want me to sit here? Okay. Let me sit away from the camera. So that it doesn't matter.
That's fine.
Okay.
Oh, so you can shift.
You gotta be on
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You ended up with questions to us. So I
Right.
think we have more questions.
You're in charge of the
But
question.
critique as well. You-
Yeah, of course. I want to flag from the beginning that one of the strengths, I think, listening to you, I would say one of the strengths of the book is precisely the refusal to civilizational shortcuts. Rather than asking whether Islam is for or against democracy, you insist on history, institutions, political struggle as real experience variables. My question then is, why did you choose this method?
I think it was experience. When I started this intellectual journey 30 years ago, I landed in a place called Algeria. And there was an Islamist-inspired movement against the state. And I was really interested in speaking to these young people, not just men, but some women,
in the movement as to why they continued insisting in the streets that Islam was a solution. And I think it was there that I started to understand the tension between indigenous understandings of identity and how they conflicted with the colonial legacy. Algeria, as explained by our wonderful theorist Frantz Fanon, was torn apart psychologically by the imposition of French colonialism that almost destroyed indigenous religious institutions. And unbeknownst to me at the time, that only developed over time, I started beginning to be sensitive to the dialectic between the power of colonialism and how it affects identity and forms governance, and how Muslims from the Muslim tradition could call upon the principles of justice and equity to motivate a movement of resistance that was framed in Islam. But one thing that I've come to appreciate over my 30 years of studying the subject, and one thing that I've learned from having been in Algeria and Nigeria and Egypt and Tunisia, is there's a difference between stimulating a movement and governing. That's why I call it movements, ideologies, and governance in comparative perspective. Islam informs identity. Islam informs resistance movements. Islam informs governmental structures. So those are the three domains: movement, identity, and governmental structures. But within these three arenas, the outcomes are for the most part unpredictable. So the question then becomes, as social scientists or people who care about justice, how do we understand outcomes? And this is where simply being a political scientist and being a sociologist is not enough. That you really have to be an Islam. Because you need to understand how power is deployed and resisted across time. And when you see that, that is where the notion of contingency arises. Because that's where the dialectic of struggle manifests itself. Between those who have power and those who don't have power. Those who have power, how do they articulate their right to have power within a philosophical or a theological framework? For those who are resisting power, how do they draw upon the Quran to resist power? And this is what gives us this tremendous complexity about thinking about political Islam, is that the outcomes are not predictable. They're entirely reliant upon movements or agents making very specific decisions at specific moments in time that have consequences, often employing the power of the state. The people in Iran who are in control of the state, they're calling for Islam. But it's their understanding of Islam under the supreme leader, under the control of the Revolutionary Guard that is in control of the state. The people are resisting, like in the Arab Spring. Respect, karam, respect, you know?
I think we're gonna get into that.
Okay, sorry, I talked to you. But that's the,
To the idea
you know,
of
when you
shura.
ask a professor one question.
Yes, exactly. So I still a little bit on the methodology, but more importantly, when someone looks at the book, says political Islam, movements, etc., etc. Now, this already signals to a lot of people that this is about political Islam. But you open up by comparing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, then treating Islam in isolation. Now, why was it important for you to begin with a comparative perspective, a framework, rather than a purely Islamic?
Because I wanted to show to the reader that Islam and the state were not particular to Islam. That they applied in the Christian world and they applied in the Jewish world as well. There is a tendency in Western academia to make Islam the exception. And when you make the Islam the exception, you diabolize Islam. Oh, it's that weird thing over there that's exceptional and they're different. And they're just not part of our tradition. What I was trying to do in chapter 1 is to say, no, the three monotheistic religions engage these questions the same way with different outcomes. Yeah.
Your discussion of ancient Israel, I would say, emphasizes limit on sacrilege, kingship. How should you, how should we, in general, everybody here, think about this when contemporary debates about debates often as in the religious politics necessarily means unchecked authority? Like
Well,
in
as I
the
was,
case, in the case of Iran, for example,
well, that's the
religious politics.
that is the case of Iran, and that's why I'm trying to explain in the second chapter, and when I also talk about in the separate chapter on Iran, about how that is a particular outcome. I go into a great deal of depth of discussion about how the Ayatollah Khomeini came up with his concept about Wilayat al-Faqih. I then go on to discuss 4 other Ayatollahs and one secular critic, all of whom disagreed with how he was about to establish the state. So he was the only one. But this is again gets to the question of contingency. He was the one who had the support of the military and the merchant class to seize the state. And they all believed that his articulation of governance would bring justice and fairness to Iran. But the Iranian people had been warned by the other 4 Ayatollahs. No, you don't want to go down this road. You don't want to put all of this power in the Ayatollah. So what happened? He imprisoned 2 of the Ayatollahs. One died shortly at the beginning of the revolution, and one died 20 years later. But they didn't have any voice because they were in prison. And the other Ayatollah, who was a critic, was resident in Najaf, so he was beyond the control of the Iranians.
Now, when we talk about divine rights in Turkey, the idea of universalism and particularism, you describe a long march from divine rights to popular sovereignty. Now, to what extent do you think this has been mistakenly universalized and therefore to be imposed, especially used as a benchmark in
Well, what happened in the post-World War II settlement was the notion of the construction of rule of law universalized, with the notion that the architecture of law, as articulated by the victors of World War II, by the French and the English and the American legal tradition, would provide the basis of the universal law. That post-World War II settlement was probably unaware and uncaring about whether there were Islamic alternatives. The question of the Islamic alternative doesn't arrive to the Iranian Revolution. And that is when thinkers about governance have to think about alternate ways of governance and the conversation that it's going to have with Islam. And then leading intellectuals in the West, Samuel Huntington among them, then come up with this architecture of it's us against them. And it's us against communists, kind of dualism that lacks the kind of historical, philosophical, and theological sophistication that's really required to understand either Islam or Buddhism in a sophisticated and sensitive manner. That's how you get to this false universalism. It all comes from the World War II setting.
The concept of tawhid is, of course, Sharia, the future in the book, the keyword of reason and logic. Your treatment of Ibn Rushd and Al-Ghazali, one is a rationalist, the other is a critique of Orthodox philosophy, and the revelation and the regime debate. Now, it is fascinating, I think, but if we think counterfactually, how different might modern Islamic political thought look like if the rationalist tradition had remained institutionally dominant?
Well, that's a question that's very difficult to answer because the debate between the Ahl al-Hadith and the Ahl al-Ra'yi goes back to the 13th century. There's always been that tension within Islamic jurisprudential thought about what the proper role of the independent exercise of reason should be. In the Shia tradition, it's elevated to an extent that it's not elevated in the Sunni tradition. But even within the Sunni tradition, rational analysis is elevated in ways in the Maliki thought that it's not elevated in Hanbali thought. Again, it gets back to what I'm saying in the book, is that if you really want to understand, you have to go deep. You have to understand deeply what the arguments are, who is making the arguments, what the outcomes of the arguments were. Now, the outcome of the point that I wanted to make is that Aquinas never gave Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and Maimonides their due. He talked about reason and revelation, having read Ibn Sina, having read Ibn Rushd, and having read Maimonides, but never spoke about them because of Catholic anti-Muslim sentiment and Catholic anti-Jewish sentiment. But his teacher at the University of Paris, Albertus Magnus, recognized all of it. So you see how the debate outcomes of significant thinkers does make a difference that are really consequential, because and it's really Aquinas, once Aquinas says that reason is a gift from God and must be exercised, that opens up the secular space. And in that space, you can get Locke, you can get Madison, you can get Jefferson. They fall right in that space. They can all, Jefferson, even though he was a slaveholder, was kind of religious. They can fall into that space with their congregation.
You did mention something as a political student of political science. I was, it was fascinating to hear you look at the minimalist and the maximalist, school of thought in terms of democracy. We've seen across many African countries where you have Islam, we've seen politicization of Islam and Islamization of politics in many African countries, where you see leaders using Islam to maybe get their followers, but also using Islam to get money from these houses. We've seen contexts like that. Do you think the minimalist definition of democracy, I would say, have intentionally made it easier for authoritarian?
Oh, sure. I mean, we're seeing it not only in African states. I mean, you see it in places in Eastern Europe like Hungary. You win the, or Turkey. You win the election, won the election. I'm going to form the state on my own basis, you know. So that's where that's the minimalist trap, and that's why I mentioned the maximalist school.
I think this is important in terms of like when we make distinction between Islamic studies, between election, but then also global liberal that we have in
Well, welcome to the U.S.
I want us to move on to you mentioned 5 of them, but I'm gonna just look at 3 of them. The foundational principles of Islamic jurisprudence. One of which is shura, which is consultation, ijma, which is consensus, and mashallah, which is public interest, I would say. You saw that Islamic political thought has its own internal resource of accountability and public welfare. What, in your view, has most constrained the translation of this concept into durable modern institutions?
You know, we have these wonderful thinkers, like Khalid Abdul-Fawad, Abdullahi al-Naim, you know, we're comfortable in Chicago or Toronto or Emory, and, you know, we know the Quran well, and we can, on the basis of democracy, we can articulate ideas about how true democracy can be based upon these principles with which we hold.
Yeah.
Then there's the politics of power.
Yes.
And when you get to the politics of power, as you know from having lived in this world, it involves self-enrichment. It involves the maximization of personal gains, or the maximization of gains for your group. And then that's where we move from theory into governance, right? We analytically, I think it's important for us to remain cognizant that these are 2 separate domains.
Yes.
Because if we can go back to the source that tells us that there are Quranic bases for democracy, we can always go back to that to re-articulate our goals and form the basis of movement and resistance. When we put on our other hat of real politics, well, then we also realize that it's a struggle for power.
When you were talking about hybrid legal systems, let's say in Nigeria, you have the Sharia and then you have the British law. In some context, I was born in the Gambia, more recently Middle East, but what we have in that part of West Africa is the 3 systems. You have the Islamic, you have the English legal system, and you have the traditional.
Of course.
Yes. which is separate.
Even in Nigeria.
Yes, which is separate from all these ones. And I think this is where the book is particularly useful for African students of African studies, looking at oral history, how they, intersect in many ways. But your technology, I would say, usefully somehow destabilized the idea of a single Islamic state. Which of these models do you see as most politically unstable over the long time in the world?
They're all unstable. I've spent time in Tunisia, and the outcome there is just disastrous. I've spent long time in Nigeria. The internal social dynamics of the state are always conflictual, regrettably so, but somehow Nigeria survives. Egypt and Turkey have both gone in an authoritarian direction. Oh, the most hopeful, I have some hope. Maybe Malaysia and Indonesia, seem to be a little bit more stable, seem to have found a formula for their incorporation of non-Muslim societies. So, yeah, I think within the type, I've never been asked a question, but if I would review it, I think the Southeast Asian model, at least empirically, seems to be more stable than the others.
You treated outcomes as contingent rather than theologically determined.
Right.
What rules of external outcomes, let's say colonial or contemporary outcomes, be most accountable for in shaping these trajectories?
I don't know if the right word is accountable, because accountable provokes a question of reparations.
Okay.
It's accountable, you could also, another word is derivative.
Absolutely.
I mean, the highest court in Nigeria is the Privy Council in London. Okay. The highest court in Malaysia is the Privy Council in London. French law still applies in some cases in Egypt.
In Senegal.
In Senegal as well?
Yes.
Okay. This, I think, supports my thesis
Absolutely.
that we cannot understand this Muslim political world with, as Brodel would say, a longue durée perspective. Colonialism will always be there, and it needs to be understood in terms of how it operates, either in government or in the formation of identity. Because notice how colonialism forms the identity of post-colonial elites, which is not something that I really touched on in the book, but something that I've experienced in the course of 30 years of field research. That's another topic, but it's an important one.
I think one of your thesis, which is of course very interesting, there's no single Islamic model of governance.
Yes, that is my
which
point.
is very important. So
There are these five that I argue.
yes.
And it's up to the readers to agree or disagree, because I'm interested in a critique.
Yes. So I'm saying that to say what the book invites us to do is for me to replace civilizational judgment with political emphasis. I think that's really important. That's my one.
That's really kind of.
Enduring contribution that you have in the book. And this is not only for the Middle East or Africa, but of course, broader global south.
Well, you know, I tried not to ignore Africa because there is an analysis of Nigeria within the book. But after 30 years of doing this, I started small in Algeria. I made the lens a little bit larger in Nigeria. And then after 30 years, I said, let me try to go as wide as possible, even though that's risky. Because I think not, if not now, when? All right.
Yes. One final question, and I think this has to do with the idea of indigenous knowledge or indigenous ways of knowing. In the Middle East, probably Islam was not indigenized. I think it was in places like Senegal, where you have the coexistence of traditional values and Islamic values in many contexts. What were the most palpable differences that you saw studying Nigeria in comparison to places like in terms of Islam and society?
Well, take example, my chapter on the Taliban. Pashtunwali, which is Pashtun tribal customs, is fully integrated into the Taliban state. So there's a parallel there between there and Nigeria and Gambia. It may be less observable in places that I've been to, like Tunisia. I spent time in Tunisia, I spent time in Libya, I spent time in Egypt. But even there, traditional practices most often expressed in Sufism, right,
Yes.
are expressed within Islam. So whereas in West Africa, indigenous sentiments can be expressed through customary law and customary practices, what is observable in my experience in North Africa, the Sahel, and West Africa, is that indigenous expressions are manifest in Sufi movements, which are more well attended than we think they are.
Right. Now, I'm gonna open up for questions from the audience in